Hello and welcome back to another Institute Weekly Review. Mason and Tyler bringing you three more articles we're discussing this week. We're starting out with the White House helps Micron stand up facilities in Idaho and New York. Then we'll move to settle satellite squabble. Think tankers suggest NRO should stay in own lane. And finally, we'll wrap up with time is running out to find rare collectible Bitcoin. So I'll throw it over to you, Tyler, to dive into our first article.
Okay, so if you guys weren't paying attention to the news about a couple weeks ago at the end of April 25th, Biden announced that basically he was going to partner with Micron to give them 6.1 billion to basically make new semiconductor facilities in both New York and Idaho. The company that he partnered with is called Micron, and they're basically a leading figure in memory technology. So what they're going to be making these fabs is basically the semiconductors that go into that. It's going to be happening in both Idaho and Syracuse, New York. And what I thought was kind of interesting about this was the fact that, like, if you look at Idaho, it's a Republican state, like through and through. Like the entire delegation is Republican, and then New York is pretty much entirely Democrat. So I thought it was kind of cool that it's like bipartisan in this way. And I don't think it's likely that like Idaho's gonna flip. So it was certainly really interesting to see that.
Do you think that's an indication that this is, maybe the first true piece of bipartisan legislation in a while, or is this a case where money's on the table? Now that it's on the table, it doesn't matter what affiliation you are, whether you want it or not on the table, you're going to want that money. I guess that was any indication of that? Kind of a everyone
I
wants to bring money home, or actually bipartisan action.
It's hard for me to tell exactly because Micron is headquartered in Idaho. Um,
Mm,
so that's why I'm like, it might just be that he really wanted it in New York.
yeah. No, I
But
might be just asking a question that's too early on in the CHIPS Act's effect to
yeah,
actually be.
but I will
Yeah.
say that like they could easily have seen like, hey, because I think two out of the three facilities are in Idaho.
Mm-hmm.
So they could have said no, like if
Mm-hmm.
that was their only motivation. So I think it does indicate that people are thinking a little bit more like, hey, look, the CHIPS Act is supposed to spread the wealth a little bit through the United States, especially to areas that are kind of more rural. And when we think about Idaho, Boise, which is where this is like headquartered,
Mm-hmm.
is not exactly rural, but the whole state itself is.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, they're kind of getting what they want. But I guess another thing I'll kind of throw back at you is like, so we're seeing this in Syracuse, New York, kind of a city. We're seeing this in Boise, Idaho, or Boise. But a lot of these things, like we heard like about a month ago that they were building another facility in Indiana,
Mm-hmm.
but it's in West Lafayette, which is already a place that has a university. I'm kind of thinking like they really need to spread this pie out from places other than Arizona, this and this. Like we need to see stuff like in like let's say Montana or like Iowa or something like that.
Yeah, I will say in this article it did also touch on Intel and TSMC, and they had, I think, a facility going up in Arizona, if I believe, so not outside of that. But there was, I want to say Michigan. It is slipping my mind exactly right now, but there was one state that popped up that I did think, oh, spreading the love a little bit. But you're absolutely right. From what I've seen, it does seem like very similar states are getting a lot of these, um, which might be a facet of they already have some of that there. It makes sense to put more there, but
But it
one.
seems like it's defeating the point. Like, I think the like some of the point from like when we read that act, it's like it's talking about we got to democratize this. We got to, you know, if all these places are already. And here's the thing, right? If there are other industries in those areas that people want to go work for
Mm,
already, now you're competing.
mm,
Is that good? I don't think so.
right, right. You're kind of fishing out of the same pond to get the engineers and workers and actual muscle behind this movement all from the same pool instead of a bunch of different ponds across the country.
Yeah.
Um, there is one additional area I want to talk about this as a the CHIPS Act is very much domestic policy, but I think unspoken, it has wide-reaching global impacts on, like, really it is almost foreign policy as to how it relates with China, Taiwan, global competition for semiconductors. I think that that's a very interesting discussion to have, and I do want to bookmark our wrap up if that's okay with you, because I would love to dive into that, the CHIPS Act as a foreign policy as well. But I will leave it just with that primer, and I will move us on to the article you prepared for us today.
Okay. So what you're seeing here is two agencies, all right? So this is the National Reconnaissance Office, or NRO, and then the other one is the Space Force. Space Force is kind of new, but anyway, like the NRO historically has been like the chief organization that has basically put out requests for like exquisite satellites, and what I mean by that is basically like DoD satellites that are made and over-engineered to meet some sort of crazy mission, like seeing something with like 3 centimeter details or something from like a crazy high altitude.
Mm-hmm.
And a report out from the American Enterprise Institute. That's a right wing kind of leaning group, so that kind of has a little bit of connotation. So take it with whatever you think that might mean. And they think that actually when you bring along the Space Force, that kind of changes this dynamic a little bit about who should be in charge of making the sats and controlling the sats. And they argue that the NRO should really try to lean into making like these really exquisite, highly expensive satellites. And when we're talking about like making these little, what I would say are like the great value satellites, essentially like Walmart brand satellites.
Yeah.
The United States Space Force should be the one in charge of that. And the key article that or key question I'll kind of lead to you is this. So the reason they said that is, well, one, like the National Reconnaissance Office can do that already, and also like they have that experience, but they say that it's actually important that they keep pressing to fight for those satellites because having exquisite, really, really crazy satellites like that is a deterrence in itself. So I was
Mm-hmm.
thinking like, oh man, like that's interesting. Like, but what is a better deterrence? Having like, crazy nuclear technology or hypersonic missiles? Or
Mm-hmm.
is it something like a satellite that in real time can see like an individual person, like can make out their face?
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
I guess
what
that
is
maybe from my perspective, as maybe someone naive to the NRO, somewhat familiar with the Space Force as just a general consumer of American media, but why is it important for the NRO to be separate from the Space Force? I guess why couldn't the NRO be uh, under the Space Force umbrella and still kind of have both be true? Is it a matter of allocating of budgets that people are concerned that the NRO won't be invested in if the Space Force, prefers to do other tech?
think about it like this, right? So the people that are in charge of the NRO, they have a vested interest in maintaining their position. If they become a part of the Space Force, well, then now there's some basically military official that's automatically above them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what you're kind of getting at is you're noticing the fact that these agencies are headed by people that are somewhat political, and they
Mm-hmm.
have budgets that they want to maintain, and they also want to maintain their position.
Hmm. I I guess I just have a hard time seeing why the Space Force shouldn't manage these exquisite satellites. I think the
That's kind of what is like happening here. So like the Space Force has at times asserted that they should, and the NRO doesn't like that because it's just stepping on their toe. It's like, no, this is what I do. And if you start taking that, then there's no reason I should exist. So then that's bad for me.
right, okay. I from from my perspective, this seems like the NRO was put in place to solve a hole that we weren't quite ready for Space Force, but we realized we needed some activity up there, some organization to kind of be America's interest up there. The NRO was that. Now the Space Force exists, and we're looking at it and saying the NRO maybe doesn't need to exist. And I guess I would say it doesn't. I would say it probably should be streamlined into one organization if they're both working towards the same goal of
Well,
American interest in space.
The difference would be that the NRO is like focused exquisitely on getting or focused solely on just recon data,
Mhm.
whereas like the Space Force it has a much broader portfolio because they might be concerned with like how do you protect satellites or how do you you know how
Yeah.
do you mobilize stuff in space if that's how we get there, or like in the future they'll probably be in charge of logistics in space,
Mhm.
like how like if we want to go and ship something instead of through like land, we might use space, and in which case they might say the NRR might say, well, hey, look, our mission is really important as well, and you'll have too much focus or
Too
too
much
much of
on
a
your plate to
yeah.
give it the attention it needs. I think that's a valid argument, but
I think I agree with you overall.
yeah, I guess of course, very naive perspective. I'm sure there's a lot of intricacies that we can't cover, but it seems like we're both on the same page, at least with our opinions. That's what we're sharing. But I will move us on to our final article if we have time. After all of our other discussion, we can jump back. But what I want to cover is a very somewhat recent development in the Bitcoin world. I really wanted to take a trip. I've been presenting a lot of articles that I find as kind of doomer, as the kids would say these days, and I wanted to give something that I just thought was genuinely interesting, with really not the most. No one's gonna die over this, which I think is nice to see. But what it is a new development in Bitcoin, which are the in Bitcoin's attempt to compete with Ethereum's NFTs, the ability to have non-fungible tokens on the blockchain. Someone wrote an add-on, like a cover for Bitcoin, that gives it what's called satoshis. You can think of satoshis as cents to a dollar. There's 100 million satoshis in one Bitcoin. It's just a way of making individual components of the big piece, which doesn't seem like it has that big of effects. However, what this has done has led to kind of a wild west on rare bitcoins, you can say, where all of a sudden, because there's some, it's not all bitcoins are identical. There's actual difference between them. Some of them are more desirable than others. So satoshis that were the very first ones minted, maybe are more desirable. I think it's interesting to see that even in the completely digital space, collectors are coming in and finding things that maybe are manufactured value on these. As you can see, I have here a 1945 Lincoln cent penny, which was stamped incorrectly, which is an extremely valuable penny to collectors nowadays. That same kind of thing is occurring to Bitcoin, which has always generated novelty to me to see where this value is pulled out of kind of thin air. Um, Before I kind of gush about it, I think this is pointless. This is a pointless discussion, or this addition to Bitcoin is relatively pointless in the scheme of the world. However, like with all changes to something people hold near and dear, this was met with a huge amount of resistance from the Bitcoin community, saying that they hated it. They think it's the worst idea ever. They don't want to enter the competition like NFTs. NFTs really left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouth. However, progress moves forward. People are collecting these, and one Satoshi, which is worth about 6 cents, recently sold for over $2 million, just to show you the scale of where this is going. I don't want to keep rambling on it. Is there any questions that this pulls out of you?
Okay, so essentially this is okay, so you divide it into basically cents, right? And then
Yes.
that's a Satoshi. So how many like it's uniform, right? So like there's a certain number of Satoshis that equals a Bitcoin.
Yep. Yep. And
Okay,
every
okay.
Satoshi, if you have 100 million Satoshis, you have one Bitcoin. Doesn't matter which ones you're able to collect. So it's essentially just penny collecting for Bitcoin, which is why I thought it was
It makes,
hilarious. I'm not gonna lie.
it makes me wonder if that was kind of a similar thing that happened with like our actual money.
Mm-hmm.
Like someone was just like, "Oh yeah, here's a gold bar," and then suddenly someone was like, no, here's a gold coin now." You know what I mean?
my
It,
coin's cooler.
yeah, yeah. Like, oh, that's funny. I
To
guess the thing that so you were struck by just based off this idea that people make value kind of out of like thin air.
yes,
Okay. I think that's really interesting because it kind of gets at like what we were having a discussion about, a couple weeks ago or maybe it was months ago. We were talking about like where does the value come for like any of these currencies.
yeah.
So I think it's interesting. Like it kind of highlights something maybe about our currencies generally. Like we can like the stories that we have is what makes the actual value.
Wow. I don't think I can say anything more poetic, so I'm just going to move on from that into our backlog. I did want to jump back to this one. I know I mentioned it earlier. I got all excited. I wanted to have a
Yeah.
discussion about the CHIPS Act as foreign policy, specifically relating to America's promised defense of Taiwan. I think on the surface, as like a projecting American exceptionalism, we want to defend the democracy from China. It's a holdout. It's a potential. We essentially have a footprint on China's door. However, I think it's really impossible to talk about Taiwan and its relationship with America and the rest of the world without discussing TSMC and their semiconductor. The essentially the most advanced semiconductor creation facility in the entire planet. Do you think that the CHIPS Act, if we increase America's ability to create these chips, will cause a reduction in our willingness to defend Taiwan and commit to Taiwan and essentially enforce Taiwan's existence onto the world?
I think that was one of the goals basically. It was like so that we could pull out like if that happens because they kind of make us extend into a region we don't really want to.
The way, yes, I definitely, I mean, undisputedly, with China's recent aggression towards Taiwan, if China seizes Taiwan, America is really in kind of a bad place as far as their leverage over us with the chips. So undisputed, I think that it's a defensive maneuver. But do you think it will result in a retraction of America's stance on Taiwan?
Hmm. Uh, yeah, I guess given what we did in Ukraine, purely like the argument is pretty much, hey, look, they're against an autocratic state, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you're right. You're getting at that we wouldn't even pull out because we
Mm-hmm.
would say, oh, look, here's a budding democracy.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think I actually might agree with you that even though the stated goal is we're going to get out, maybe we would still lead the tie purely just so we can, you know, force ourselves on China.
Yeah, I mean, it is when you look at America's ability to demonstrate their military power. If they're doing it from Hawaii, it's much different than if they're doing it from Taiwan, mere miles away from China's mainland. Um, any final thoughts? I guess I know I kind of
I
word
guess you're,
vomited at you there for a second.
yeah. So one thing I was thinking about, you started thinking about this foreign policy idea. Um, I think it's interesting that so we go and we invest in like TSMC. We go and we invest in SK Hynix in Indiana. But then here is like one of the first one. Well, we also invest in Intel.
Mm-hmm.
But like the goal of the CHIPS Act is basically to onshore all this in America. Like we should see more investments in Microns and Intels and less in SK Hynix, South Korean company,
Mm-hmm.
and Samsung and TSMC. So I find it really interesting.
Right, we're saying this is a national defense. We need this on American soil, and then we bring in, you know, Taiwanese, South Korean companies to do it for us, and it's is is that what we want? Maybe that strengthens our ties globally. Maybe it increases our alliance. They definitely are
And one thing
attached.
I'll mention with memory technology in particular is so we've invested. I'm pretty sure we've invested in Samsung, but I know for sure that we've invested in SK Hynix in Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
Um, those two combined make up about 70% of the memory like semiconductor market. So I think that's really interesting. We invested in them because we're bolstering them, and if they have such a huge control over that, I don't really see how we could compete if they have such a huge market share, because then they could basically almost collude to basically like choke out Micron.
Right. Are we creating a monopoly that we're not in charge of?
Yeah,
Is kind of the question.
but that's all I have.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, we will cover this again. We will hopefully have answers to the questions we proposed in a future episode. Join us then.